In the fall of 1798, 17 travelers vanished along a 20-mile section of the Wilderness Road in southeastern Kentucky. Each one disappeared without a single clue, their horses left abandoned and their belongings scattered, offering no story of what had happened. What makes these events so deeply unsettling isn't merely the number of victims, but the fact that local officials intentionally buried every record of the ensuing investigation. For more than 200 years, the truth surrounding the Harden family farm stayed locked away in sealed court documents, until a county clerk's discovery in 1987 brought to light the most horrifying case of organized murder in the history of the early American frontier. Those papers describe a killing operation so methodical, so perfectly disguised as Christian charity, that it continued undetected for 8 long years. Before we go further into the story of the farm that became Kentucky's original house of horrors, remember to subscribe to our channel and tap that notification bell. We are going to unearth secrets that influential families attempted to keep buried for all time. And let us know in the comments which state you're listening from. We truly enjoy hearing from our community of mystery lovers. The discovery that would ultimately reveal the Harden family's atrocities began not with screams in the darkness, but with the simple routine of bureaucratic maintenance in a dusty courthouse basement. Southeastern Kentucky in 1798 was a territory caught between civilization and the raw wilderness, a place where the dream of a better life drew thousands of settlers along dangerous mountain trails. The Wilderness Road, carved through the Cumberland Gap by Daniel Boone 20 years prior, had become the main route for those moving west from Virginia and the Carolinas. This narrow, winding path stretched for more than 200 miles through some of the most brutal landscape in North America, where one wrong step could mean death from exposure, wild animals, or the many human predators lurking on the frontier. Dozens of small settlements had sprung up along this hazardous route, like wildflowers after a rain. Each one served as a beacon of hope for families searching for a new start in the untamed West. These communities were vital waypoints where weary travelers could find rest, replenish their supplies, and learn about the dangers that lay ahead. The survival of these towns often hinged on their capacity to offer safe harbor for the endless flow of migrants passing through. The settlement of Milfield was positioned at a critical bend in the road, where the trail dipped down from the rocky highlands into the fertile basin of Beaver Creek. With a population of just 300 souls, it was the sort of place where everyone knew each other's business, or believed they did. The town had been founded in 1794 by a congregation of Virginia Baptists seeking religious freedom, and their impact was visible in every facet of daily life. Sunday services were compulsory for every resident, and the town council upheld strict moral codes that regulated everything from alcohol consumption to dancing. The community centered on Hendrick's General Store, a worn log structure that functioned as both a trading post and an informal courthouse. Jeremiah Hendricks, a stern former militiaman who had fought alongside Daniel Boone, managed the place with absolute authority and a sharp instinct for profit. His shelves carried anything a journeyer might require: gunpowder, salt, whiskey, blankets, and the most recent news from the civilized world east of the mountains. Close by stood the Cumberland Inn, a 2-story building that represented the peak of frontier comfort. Martha Crane, the widow who owned the inn, had come from Philadelphia 5 years before with sufficient funds to construct the finest lodging between Lexington and the Virginia border. For 2 bits a night, travelers could get a hot meal and a clean bed, along with the kind of refined conversation that reminded them of the homes they had left behind. The town's spiritual heart was the New Jerusalem Baptist Church, a humble log building large enough to hold the entire populace for Sunday services. Reverend Ephraim Cole, a Harvard-educated preacher who had left a comfortable Boston parish for frontier missionary work, delivered sermons that mixed traditional scripture with practical wisdom for surviving in a merciless land. His presence gave Milfield a feeling of legitimacy that drew settlers who might have otherwise continued on without pausing. The Harden family stood among Milfield's most esteemed residents: Ezekiel, his wife Temperance, and their 3 grown children, sons Caleb and Josiah, and daughter Mercy. The family had arrived in the spring of 1791, stating they were refugees from vicious Indian raids that had destroyed their former home in eastern Virginia. They quickly became pillars of the small community, with Ezekiel acting as a lay preacher who supported Reverend Cole, and Temperance coordinating charitable works for destitute families who arrived with little more than the garments they wore. Ezekiel Harden was a man who demanded respect through pure force of character, standing well over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of a man used to hard labor. He had a physical stature that made other men step back when he walked into a room. His resonant voice could fill the church without any strain, delivering sermons that brought listeners to tears with their fervent depictions of divine grace and stark warnings of eternal damnation. Those who listened to him preach often commented that he spoke with the conviction of a man who had seen both heaven and hell with his own eyes. Temperance Harden was just as remarkable in her own right. A petite, fine-boned woman with prematurely silver hair and hands that were never still, she had become the community's unofficial doctor. Her understanding of medicinal herbs was vast, and she could handle everything from broken bones to complicated childbirths with a skill that seemed almost otherworldly. More than one family owed their lives to her late-night visits in times of emergency, and her fame for medical wonders had traveled all through the county. Their children appeared to be perfect models of frontier goodness. Caleb, the older son at 26, had his father's powerful build and his mother's gentle nature. He worked the family land with relentless dedication, while still making time to aid elderly neighbors with their own harvests. Josiah, 24, was slighter in frame, but more scholarly, frequently acting as the community's part-time schoolteacher during the winter months when farming work was slow. At 22, Mercy was regarded as one of the most lovely young women in the county, with a kind nature that made her well-liked by both men and women. The Harden farm spread across 400 acres of prime bottom land along Beaver Creek, 3 miles south of town. The property had cost Ezekiel almost all the money he had, but the purchase had been a wise one. The fertile soil yielded bountiful crops of corn and tobacco, while the creek supplied water for livestock and power for a small grist mill that served the local area. Visitors often commented on the farm's remarkable prosperity, observing that the Hardens appeared to possess more material wealth than could be accounted for by farming alone. Ezekiel had constructed his homestead with meticulous attention to both comfort and security. The main house was a 2-story log structure with stone chimneys and glass-paned windows, an almost unimaginable luxury on the frontier. The rooms were appointed with pieces that seemed far too elegant for a simple farming family: carved chairs, imported china, silver candlesticks, and books that hinted at learning and sophistication. A massive barn could stable 50 horses, while a collection of outbuildings included a smokehouse, a dairy, a blacksmith shop, and what Ezekiel called the largest root cellar in the entire county. What made the Hardens especially valued in the community was their readiness to aid travelers in need. The frontier showed no mercy to those who journeyed alone or unprepared, and hardly a week went by without someone arriving at the farm, seeking help. More than once, Ezekiel had ridden out into perilous conditions to aid a damaged wagon or an injured horse, frequently inviting stranded families to take shelter at his farm until things could be mended. Such neighborly kindness was viewed as a Christian obligation on the frontier, but the Hardens practiced it to a remarkable degree. Temperance was especially known for her readiness to treat hurt or ill travelers, regardless of their ability to pay. Her medical knowledge had saved numerous lives, and many families were only able to continue their journeys because of her care. She kept a well-supplied infirmary in one of the outbuildings, complete with surgical tools and medicines that most frontier physicians could only wish for. The family's reputation for generosity had become so well established that by 1798, it was typical for travelers to deliberately seek out the Harden farm when mapping their route. Local guides regularly directed parties toward Beaver Creek, assuring them that the Hardens would offer fair prices for provisions and secure lodging for the evening. The family's guest register, which Mercy kept with meticulous care, logged hundreds of visitors over the years: merchants, ministers, families, and solitary adventurers who had found sanctuary at the thriving farm. But in the harsh truth of frontier existence, where death waited behind every tree and trust could be fatal, appearances could be more than deceptive. They could be murderous. The initial indication that something was horribly wrong emerged on October 13, 1798, when a merchant named Samuel Fletcher did not arrive in Lexington as planned. Fletcher was no ordinary wayfarer. He was one of the most seasoned and dependable merchants on the Wilderness Road, a man whose punctuality had earned him wealth in a world where timing could separate profit from ruinous loss. For 12 years, he had made the hazardous trip between Virginia and Kentucky 4 times each year, transporting manufactured goods westward and raw materials back east. Fletcher's business associate, Thomas Grelly, had collaborated with the merchant long enough to know his patterns completely. Fletcher never strayed from his intended schedule without sending word, and he never took foolish chances that might endanger his valuable cargo. When Grelly received no message after 5 days, 2 days past Fletcher's expected arrival, he understood something disastrous had occurred. Grelly's search started at dawn on October 18th, tracing Fletcher's known route in reverse from Lexington. He questioned innkeepers, merchants, and farmers along the path, each of whom verified that Fletcher had come through on schedule. The trail stayed clear until Grelly reached the area around Milfield, where Fletcher seemed to have simply evaporated. The finding of Fletcher's horse came at noon on the 2nd day of searching. The distinctive bay mare was discovered grazing untethered near Miller's Creek, still wearing its saddle, but displaying no signs of injury or panic. The animal looked well fed and cared for, as if it had been purposely set free rather than lost in a fright. Most baffling of all, the horse's bridle had been taken off and hung neatly on a nearby tree branch, an action that implied human involvement rather than a simple accident. Fletcher's saddlebags were still intact, holding his trading items and a leather pouch containing nearly $50 in silver coins, a fortune representing months of hazardous labor. The money's presence eliminated simple theft, the most frequent reason for frontier disappearances. Even more alarming, Fletcher's personal items were scattered in a deliberate line leading away from the road into the deep woods, as if he had been made to drop them one by one while being pulled from his horse. The local constable, Jacob Winters, was a man uniquely suited to look into such mysteries, a former Continental Army sergeant who had served under Anthony Wayne in the Ohio campaigns. Winters had both the investigative mind and the fortitude for violence that frontier law enforcement demanded. He had witnessed enough death and deceit to know that the most apparent explanations were frequently the most incorrect, and Fletcher's disappearance struck him as anything but ordinary. Winters put together a search party within hours of Grelly's report, gathering 12 of Milfield's most capable men for what he knew would be a challenging and possibly hazardous investigation. The search party included Henrik Johansson, a Swedish immigrant whose tracking abilities were as good as those of the local natives, and Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter who knew every hiding spot within 50 miles of town. What the search party uncovered defied all logical understanding. Fletcher's trail led unmistakably toward the Harden farm, marked by torn cloth snagged on thorns and occasional drops of what looked like blood. The signs implied that the merchant had been alive but wounded when he left the road, perhaps resisting captors who were forcing him deeper into the wild. But right at the boundary of the Harden property, every trace of Fletcher's passage simply stopped. The searchers spent hours scrutinizing the area where the trail ended, hunting for any clue that might indicate Fletcher's destiny. They found nothing. No disturbed soil, no concealed bloodstains, no proof of a fight. It was as if Samuel Fletcher had been lifted from the earth by invisible hands and carried off into the air. Even Henrik Johansson, whose tracking skills were famed, conceded defeat when faced with such a total lack of evidence. When Winters questioned Ezekiel Harden about the missing merchant, the patriarch's reply was both helpful and oddly practiced. Yes, Fletcher had stopped at the farm on October 13th, arriving just before sunset and asking for directions to a shortcut that would save him a day's travel to Lexington. Ezekiel had cautioned him against taking unfamiliar paths, particularly with valuable goods and winter weather approaching, but Fletcher had been determined to try the route. The merchant had been courteous but rushed, refusing Temperance's offer of a hot meal and a warm bed in favor of pushing on while daylight lasted. According to Ezekiel, Fletcher had seemed anxious and preoccupied, repeatedly checking his saddlebags and glancing over his shoulder as if anticipating pursuit. When asked about this behavior, Fletcher had mentioned observing strange men following him since leaving Virginia, but had waved off Ezekiel's proposal that he remain at the farm until a larger group could escort him to safety. The last the family had seen of him, Fletcher was riding north toward the ridge country, resolved to find his shortcut despite the falling darkness and threatening skies. Ezekiel's story was corroborated in exact detail by his entire family, each member giving identical descriptions of Fletcher's visit. They recalled his hurry, his dismissal of their warnings, even his specific words when refusing their hospitality. Temperance remembered that the merchant had complained of stomach troubles and had accepted a small bottle of her herbal remedy before leaving. Caleb had offered to guide Fletcher to the ridge trail, but the merchant had refused, stating that his business was too urgent for any delays. Their consistency should have been comforting to Constable Winters. Instead, it struck him as unnervingly perfect, like a tale that had been carefully practiced until every detail was memorized. Genuine witnesses in Winters' experience always contradicted each other on minor points while agreeing on major ones. The Hardens' account was too polished, too thorough, too devoid of the small discrepancies that characterized truthful testimony. The constable's suspicions intensified when he observed notable changes in the farm's layout since his last visit several months before. A new smokehouse had been constructed near the main barn, unusually large for a family operation, and built with thick stone walls that appeared designed for more than just preserving food. Fresh soil surrounded several outbuildings, as if substantial digging projects had recently been completed. Most peculiar of all, the family's root cellar looked to have been significantly expanded, with new timber supports visible around an entrance that now seemed big enough for a wagon. When Winters inquired about these improvements, Ezekiel clarified that the family had had an unusually successful harvest and had chosen to invest in better facilities for storing and processing their crops. The enlarged root cellar was needed for the greater volume of vegetables and preserved foods they intended to sell in Lexington, while the new smokehouse would let them cure meat for both family use and commercial trade. The explanations were sensible and well delivered. But something in Ezekiel's manner suggested he was selecting his words with unusual caution. Most disturbing of all, the family's typical warmth felt forced during Winters' visit, their famous hospitality carrying a subtle undercurrent of nervous energy that the constable couldn't disregard. Temperance's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee, and Mercy kept looking toward her father, as if seeking permission for each word she spoke. Even Caleb and Josiah, normally self-assured and outgoing young men, seemed quiet and watchful in ways that hinted they were concealing something important. But without solid proof of misconduct, there was little Constable Winters could legally do. Fletcher's case was officially recorded as a probable highway robbery or Indian attack. His name was added to the growing tally of frontier casualties that marked the cost of westward expansion. The merchant's horse was sold at auction to settle his outstanding debts, and within a month, Samuel Fletcher existed only in the memories of those who had known him. Yet Fletcher's disappearance would prove to be merely the start of a pattern that would terrorize the Wilderness Road for the next 8 months, turning a prosperous farming community into a place where travelers whispered cautions and parents kept their children indoors after dark. Throughout the winter of 1798 and into the spring of 1799, the vanishings continued with a terrifying regularity that defied all logical explanation. Every 2 to 3 weeks, another traveler would disappear without a trace along the same stretch of road, creating a zone of fear that extended for nearly 20 miles in every direction from Milfield. The victims differed greatly in age, wealth, and traveling situation. Solitary merchants like Fletcher, small family groups, even heavily armed parties journeying together for mutual protection. What connected them was their total disappearance, and the fact that each had been observed heading toward or inquiring about directions to the Harden farm before vanishing into the wilderness. Dr. Marcus Cromwell disappeared in November during his trip from Richmond to establish a medical practice in Louisville. The 43-year-old doctor had been transporting his life's work in the form of medical instruments, books, and supplies worth over $300, an investment that represented years of saving and planning. His wagon had been discovered overturned near Devil's Fork, 3 miles from the Harden farm, with the contents scattered but apparently untouched. Local authorities assumed that Cromwell had been thrown from his seat in an accident and had wandered into the wilderness confused, eventually succumbing to exposure. The explanation seemed reasonable until searchers found that Cromwell's medical bag was missing from the wreckage. Fame. The leather satchel contained surgical instruments of exceptional quality, including a bone saw and amputation kit that would be priceless to anyone trying to practice frontier medicine. No wild animal would have taken such items, and common thieves would have been more interested in the coins and trade goods that remained scattered around the crash site. The Henley family vanished in December during one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. Jonathan Henley, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 young children had been seeking shelter when their wagon got stuck in a snowdrift only half a mile from the Harden farm. According to Ezekiel's later account, the family had never reached his property despite the short distance, presumably becoming lost in the storm and freezing to death in the wild. Their bodies were never recovered despite thorough searches conducted when the weather cleared. What made the Henley case especially disturbing was the discovery of their wagon a week after the storm. The vehicle had been pulled from the snowdrift and abandoned beside the road, cleared of snow, and apparently searched completely. The family's clothing and personal effects were gone, but their food supplies and tools were left untouched. Most puzzling of all, tracks around the wagon indicated that several people had worked together to free it from the drift, an act that would have required significant time and effort in dangerous conditions. January brought the disappearance of Reverend Nathan Cross, a circuit preacher carrying donations for a new church in Frankfort. Cross was known throughout the region for his powerful sermons and his fearless travels through even the most dangerous parts of the frontier. The 50-year-old minister had survived Indian attacks, bandits, and countless natural dangers during 15 years of preaching, making his disappearance especially shocking to communities that had come to see him as invincible. Cross's horse was found 3 days after his disappearance, still carrying saddlebags that held nearly $200 in church donations. The money's presence ruled out robbery as a motive, but raised alarming questions about what kind of threat could have overcome such an experienced and resourceful man. Local authorities eventually concluded that Cross had suffered a heart attack or stroke while traveling, falling from his horse and dying somewhere in the vast wilderness surrounding the Wilderness Road. Each disappearance followed the same inexplicable pattern: abandoned horses found grazing loose or tied to trees, scattered personal belongings suggesting sudden violence or struggle, and trails that led inevitably toward Harden property before disappearing entirely. Yet whenever questioned by increasingly suspicious authorities, the Harden family presented believable explanations that were impossible to disprove. They had seen some of the travelers, yes, but only briefly, and usually from a distance. Each victim had been warned about various dangers: bad weather, difficult terrain, reports of bandit activity, but had chosen to continue their journey despite the family's concerned advice. In several cases, the Hardens had offered food, shelter, or escort services that had been politely declined by travelers who seemed determined to maintain their schedules regardless of risk. Constable Winters found himself trapped in an impossible situation that grew more frustrating with each new disappearance. The Hardens were among the most respected families in the county, their reputation for charity and Christian virtue unquestioned by everyone except him. Ezekiel's sermons continued to attract crowds from surrounding townships, his passionate delivery and biblical knowledge impressing even educated ministers like Reverend Cole. Temperance's medical skills had saved dozens of lives during the previous summer's fever outbreak, earning her a reputation that approached sainthood among grateful families. To accuse such pillars of the community without absolute proof would be professional suicide and social exile. Winters had seen what happened to lawmen who made accusations they couldn't substantiate. They found themselves friendless, unemployed, and sometimes facing charges of their own. The frontier operated on a complex web of personal relationships and mutual obligations, and attacking the wrong family could ruin a man's life more effectively than any legal proceeding. Moreover, the family's explanations, while consistently convenient, were entirely plausible within the context of frontier life. The Wilderness Road was genuinely dangerous, plagued by bandits, hostile Indians, severe weather, and the countless natural hazards that claimed lives regularly. Dozens of travelers disappeared each year under circumstances far less mysterious than those surrounding the Harden farm. What made this cluster of vanishings different was purely statistical: too many people too close together, all last seen in the same general area. But statistics meant little in a world where evidence was everything, and evidence seemed to evaporate like morning mist whenever investigators approached the Harden property. The family welcomed searches of their buildings and grounds, answered questions with apparent openness, and even provided volunteers for search parties that combed the surrounding wilderness for signs of the missing travelers. Their cooperation was so complete and enthusiastic that it felt almost like mockery to the increasingly frustrated constable. The first crack in the family's carefully maintained facade came from an unexpected source. 9-year-old Timothy Voren, whose family lived on a small homestead 2 miles east of the Harden farm. Timothy was known throughout the community as an imaginative child who loved to explore the woods around his family's property, often returning home with elaborate stories about the wildlife and natural wonders he had discovered during his adventures. In March 1799, young Timothy approached Constable Winters with a story that initially seemed like another product of a child's imagination. The boy claimed he had been exploring the woods near Beaver Creek when he heard screaming coming from the direction of the Harden farm. But these weren't the kind of screams that came from accidents, arguments, or even childbirth. They were the sustained, desperate cries of someone in mortal terror, rising and falling in patterns that suggested both physical pain and psychological torment. According to Timothy, he had heard such sounds at least 5 times over the winter, always during the darkest hours of night, when decent folk should be asleep. The screaming would continue for what seemed like hours, sometimes accompanied by other sounds that the boy couldn't identify, rhythmic hammering, the creak of pulleys or ropes, and occasionally what sounded like multiple voices chanting in unison. The sounds always ended abruptly, followed by a silence so complete that Timothy wondered if he had imagined the entire episode. When Winters questioned the boy's parents, they admitted to hearing strange sounds themselves, but had dismissed them as natural phenomena common to frontier life. Animal calls distorted by wind and distance, perhaps, or the sounds of nocturnal predators hunting in the wilderness. After all, the Hardens were good Christian folk who had never given anyone cause for suspicion. And what possible explanation could there be for screaming in the night coming from such a respectable household? Timothy's account might have been dismissed as childhood imagination or misinterpreted natural sounds, except for one detail that gave Constable Winters considerable pause. When pressed for specifics, the boy could accurately describe the approximate dates when he had heard the screaming, and each corresponded exactly with the estimated time of a traveler's disappearance. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental, too consistent to be explained by chance. Armed with Timothy Voren's disturbing testimony, Constable Winters began to build a case against the Harden family with the methodical patience of a man who understood that accusations against such prominent citizens would require absolutely unassailable proof. He started by quietly interviewing other neighbors who lived within hearing distance of the farm, asking carefully worded questions that wouldn't reveal his growing suspicions or alert the Hardens to his investigation. What emerged from these discreet inquiries was a disturbing pattern of small inconsistencies and unexplained phenomena that had been overlooked, dismissed, or rationalized away by people who trusted the family's reputation more than their own observations. Each piece of evidence was minor when considered individually, but together they painted a picture that made Winters' blood run cold. Sarah Mitchell, whose small farm lay closest to the Harden property, recalled several nights when she had seen unusual activity at their homestead. Lanterns moving between buildings at hours when decent folk should be sleeping. The sounds of digging and heavy construction that seemed to continue until dawn. When she had mentioned these observations to Temperance Harden after church services, the woman had offered a reasonable explanation. The family was working on extensive improvements to their root cellar and other storage facilities, and they preferred to do such labor during cool night hours rather than waste precious daylight that could be spent tending crops. The explanation had satisfied Sarah at the time, but in retrospect, she realized that the nighttime construction had continued for months longer than any reasonable building project would require. Moreover, she had never seen the massive amounts of excavated earth that such extensive digging should have produced. When pressed by Winters for more details, Sarah admitted that the sounds had often been accompanied by what seemed like muffled voices and occasionally what might have been cries of pain or distress Distress. Old Henrik Johansson, whose farm bordered the Harden property to the north, reported findings that were even more troubling. The Swedish immigrant, whose tracking and hunting skills were legendary throughout the county, had discovered animal bones scattered along their shared fence line. Wine. Not the normal remains of butchered livestock, but bones that had been cracked, gnawed, and processed in ways that suggested something far more sinister than ordinary farming activities. The bones included skulls and long bones from horses, cattle, and pigs, but also smaller fragments that Johansson couldn't identify despite his extensive knowledge of local wildlife. Most disturbing of all, some of the bones showed evidence of being deliberately broken with tools, while others saw marks that suggested systematic dismemberment rather than natural decomposition or predator activity. When Johansson had approached Ezekiel about the mysterious bone deposits, the patriarch had offered a plausible but somehow unsatisfying explanation. Wild animals had been particularly troublesome that winter, he claimed, forcing the family to dispose of several diseased livestock carcasses by scattering the remains throughout the wood. The bone fragments were simply the result of scavengers and weather breaking down these disposed carcasses over time. But Johansson's trained eye had noticed details that contradicted this innocent explanation. The bones were too clean, too systematically processed, and too widely distributed to be the result of natural decomposition. Moreover, many of the fragments showed evidence of being boiled or otherwise treated with heat, suggesting deliberate processing rather than simple disposal of diseased animals. Most tellingly, several neighbors reported dramatic changes in the Harden family's behavior and demeanor over the past year. The children, once friendly and outgoing members of the community, had become withdrawn and secretive, avoiding social gatherings and speaking only when directly addressed. Caleb and Josiah, who had previously been popular among young people their age, now seemed nervous and distracted during public interactions, as if constantly preoccupied with private concerns. Mercy Harden's transformation was particularly striking. The young woman who had once been considered one of the most beautiful and vivacious girls in the county now appeared haggard and prematurely aged, her face carrying a haunted expression that made people uncomfortable. She had stopped attending social functions entirely, and when she did appear in public, she seemed to shrink from human contact as if afraid of revealing some terrible secret. Even Ezekiel's sermons had taken on a darker tone over the past months, dwelling obsessively on themes of divine judgment, the punishment of sinners, and the necessity of eliminating evil from the world. Where his preaching had once emphasized God's love and mercy, it now focused almost exclusively on wrath and retribution. Several church members had privately expressed concern about the increasingly violent imagery in his biblical interpretations. Constable Winters also discovered disturbing gaps in the Harden family's background story that raised serious questions about their true identity and origins. While they claimed to be refugees from Indian raids in eastern Virginia, no one had been able to verify their previous residence or confirm the specific attacks that had supposedly driven them westward. Winters' inquiries to authorities in Virginia had produced no records of any Harden family being affected by Indian violence in the time period, they claimed. Moreover, the family's arrival in Kentucky seemed to mark the beginning of their documented existence, as if the Hardens had materialized from nothing in the spring of 1791. They possessed no letters from relatives, no business records from their previous life, no personal effects that predated their appearance in Milfield. For a family claiming to have lost everything to Indian raids, they had managed to arrive in Kentucky with substantial financial resources and an impressive collection of household goods. The constable's investigation received an unexpected and alarming boost in April 1799 when a traveling peddler named Isaac Brewster arrived in Milfield with information that transformed suspicion into near certainty. Brewster was a well-known figure throughout the frontier, a man whose business required him to travel constantly between settlements and who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of events and personalities throughout the region. Brewster had spent the previous winter in eastern Tennessee, where he had heard disturbing stories about a series of disappearances that had plagued the Holston River Valley between 1789 and 1791. According to local accounts, at least 15 travelers had vanished along a remote stretch of road near a prosperous farm operated by a family named Harper. Zachariah Harper, his wife Prudence, and their 3 adult children. The similarities between the Tennessee disappearances and the current Kentucky cases were so striking that they couldn't possibly be coincidental. Frontier justice moved deliberately, and judges required ironclad physical evidence before authorizing arrests that could destroy innocent lives and tear apart established communities. The constable needed proof that would stand up under the scrutiny of skeptical attorneys and suspicious juries. Evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed as coincidence. The breakthrough he desperately needed came from the last source he would have expected: Mercy Harden herself. On the night of May 22, 1799, the 22-year-old woman appeared at Winter's cabin like a ghost materializing from the darkness, her face streaked with tears and her hands trembling with barely controlled terror. What she told him during the next 3 hours would finally expose the full horror of what had been happening at the Harden farm and provide the evidence necessary to bring Kentucky's most notorious family of killers to justice. According to Mercy's devastating confession, her family had been systematically murdering travelers for over 8 years, beginning just months after their arrival in Kentucky. But what made her testimony truly horrifying was not just the scope of their crimes, but the methodical, almost ritualistic way in which the murders had been planned and executed. The killing operation, as Mercy described it, was far more sophisticated than Winters had imagined possible. Her father, Ezekiel, had convinced the family that they were carrying out God's work by eliminating what he called unworthy souls who traveled the frontier roads. The murders weren't random acts of violence driven by greed or opportunity, but carefully planned executions that served both what Ezekiel claimed was divine justice and the family's increasingly elaborate material needs. The process began with what the family called evaluation. When promising targets approached the farm, travelers with valuable goods, significant amounts of money, or skills that the family coveted, Ezekiel would engage them in seemingly innocent conversation designed to assess their moral character. He would ask about their reasons for traveling, their families, their business dealings, and their religious beliefs, all while presenting himself as a concerned Christian neighbor worried about their safety. Based on these conversations, Ezekiel would determine whether each traveler deserved what he called judgment. The wealthy were automatically guilty of greed and materialism. Educated individuals were condemned for pride and intellectual arrogance. Families traveling with young children were accused of recklessly endangering innocent lives. Even ministers and missionaries could be found guilty of false piety or doctrinal errors that marked them as heretics deserving death. Once Ezekiel had pronounced his secret verdict, the family would spring into action with the precision of a military operation. They would invite the condemned travelers to stay the night, citing concerns for their safety on dangerous roads or offering assistance with repairs to wagons or equipment. The family's reputation for hospitality made such invitations almost impossible to refuse, especially during bad weather or when travelers were genuinely in need of help. The doomed visitors would be welcomed into the main house and treated to what appeared to be genuine frontier hospitality. Temperance would prepare elaborate meals showcasing her cooking skills, while the children would entertain guests with music, conversation, and displays of their education and refinement. The evening would conclude with family prayers led by Ezekiel, whose powerful voice and biblical knowledge impressed even skeptical visitors. But the final course of every meal contained a carefully prepared mixture of herbs that Temperance had perfected over years of experimentation. The drug cocktail was virtually undetectable when mixed with strong coffee or whiskey, producing effects that mimicked natural exhaustion after a long day of travel. Victims would gradually become drowsy and disoriented, accepting the family's suggestion that they retire early to recover their strength for the next day's journey. The drug travelers would awaken to find themselves bound and helpless in the farm's underground chambers, a complex network of rooms and tunnels that had been excavated far beyond what any normal root cellar would require. According to Mercy's terrified description, the subterranean complex stretched for nearly 200 yards from the main house, with multiple levels connected by stone steps and wooden ladders. The largest chamber served as what Ezekiel called his courtroom, a grotesque parody of legal proceedings, complete with a makeshift judge's bench carved from limestone, iron shackles set into the stone walls, and religious symbols that had been perverted into instruments of terror. Here, Ezekiel would preside over formal trials that determined each captive's final fate, presenting evidence of their supposed sins and delivering verdicts that were predetermined before the proceedings even began. But the trials were not merely sadistic theater. They served a practical purpose in the family's twisted psychology. By framing the murders as acts of divine justice rather than simple crimes, Ezekiel had created a belief system that allowed his family to commit atrocities while maintaining their self-image as righteous Christians. Each killing became a religious duty, each victim a sacrifice offered to purify the frontier of unworthy souls. The sentences handed down in Ezekiel's underground courtroom varied according to his assessment of each victim's sins and the family's current needs. Some prisoners were kept alive for weeks or even months, forced to use their skills for the family's benefit before being executed. Dr. Cromwell, the physician who had disappeared in November, had been compelled to train Temperance in advanced surgical techniques before his death. Reverend Cross had been forced to write sermons that Ezekiel later delivered as his own, enhancing his reputation as a biblical scholar. Others faced immediate execution, usually by methods that Ezekiel claimed were biblically sanctioned. Hanging was reserved for thieves and bandits, while drowning in the underground cisterns was the fate of those guilty of pride or blasphemy. The most elaborate executions were saved for those whom Ezekiel judged to be the most wicked, a category that included wealthy merchants, government officials, and anyone who had shown skepticism about frontier religion. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Kentucky intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Mercy's testimony revealed the systematic nature of the family's crimes in terrifying detail. Each member had been assigned specific roles in both the murders and the elaborate cover-up that followed. Caleb and Josiah served as the muscle of the operation, responsible for capturing victims, maintaining the underground complex, and disposing of bodies through a limestone cave system that connected to the deepest parts of the excavated chambers. Their size and strength made them ideal for the physical demands of moving unconscious prisoners and heavy loads of earth and stone. Mercy herself had been forced to serve as the family's record keeper, maintaining detailed ledgers that documented every victim's identity, possessions, and method of disposal. Her careful handwriting filled dozens of notebooks with information that read like a merchant's inventory, except that the goods being cataloged were human lives and the transactions were murders. Each entry included the victim's name, age, appearance, estimated wealth, and personal belongings, along with notes about their final words and behavior during their imprisonment. Temperance's role was perhaps the most crucial to the operation's success. In addition to preparing the drugs that incapacitated victims, she served as the family's medical expert, keeping prisoners alive when their skills were needed and ensuring that executions proceeded without complications that might create evidence. Her knowledge of anatomy, gained through years of frontier medical practice, had been perverted into expertise in torture and murder. Most chilling of all, Temperance had developed what she called treatments for prisoners who proved uncooperative or attempted to escape. These punishments were designed to break the will without causing death, using techniques that combined her medical knowledge with psychological torture. Prisoners who refused to comply with the family's demands would find themselves subjected to calculated doses of pain and terror until they became completely submissive. The family's success in avoiding detection had depended on more than just careful planning. It required an elaborate system of disposal and deception that eliminated all evidence of their crimes. Bodies were never buried on the farm property itself, but were instead transported through the cave system to remote limestone caverns that lay several miles from the homestead. These natural chambers provided perfect conditions for decomposition, while their distance from the farm made discovery virtually impossible. Personal belongings were sorted with the efficiency of experienced merchants. Valuable items, money, jewelry, fine weapons, and tools were either kept by the family or sold in distant markets where they couldn't be traced to missing persons. Less valuable objects were carefully scattered along roads throughout the region, creating false trails that suggested robbery or Indian attacks. Even victims' clothing was processed systematically, with useful garments kept for the family's use while distinctive items were destroyed to prevent identification. The horses presented a particular challenge since they were both valuable and easily recognized by people familiar with the victims. The family had developed relationships with unscrupulous horse traders in distant counties who asked no questions about the animals' origins. By selling the horses far from where their owners had disappeared, the Hardens created additional false trails that further confused investigations. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of their deception was the way they used their charitable activities to deflect suspicion. Every act of kindness, every medical treatment provided by Temperance, every sermon delivered by Ezekiel served dual purposes. They genuinely helped the community while creating a reputation that made the family virtually above suspicion. Who would believe that people who saved lives during epidemics could be responsible for systematic murder? The family had even developed contingency plans for different types of investigations. If authorities became too suspicious, they would temporarily cease their killing activities while increasing their charitable works to reinforce their reputation. They had identified several escape routes that would allow them to abandon the farm quickly if discovery seemed imminent, just as they had done when leaving Tennessee years earlier. According to Mercy, the family had been planning to expand their operations significantly. They had identified several other remote farms along the Wilderness Road where similar trials could be conducted, creating a network of killing sites that would allow them to operate with even greater impunity. The ultimate goal was to establish what Ezekiel called courts of divine justice throughout the frontier, eliminating unworthy travelers on a scale that would reshape the moral character of the entire region. But what finally drove Mercy to confession was not moral awakening or sudden conscience. It was terror for her own life. She revealed that Ezekiel had grown increasingly paranoid about potential discovery and had begun to view anyone who might pose a threat as deserving of judgment. That list now included several neighbors who had asked too many questions. Isaac Brewster, the peddler who had been making inquiries about the Tennessee disappearances, and even Constable Winters himself. More immediately terrifying, Mercy disclosed that another victim was currently being held in the underground chambers, a traveling surveyor named William Patterson, who had been captured 3 days earlier and was scheduled for trial the following night. But Patterson was not the only prisoner in the family's custody. Unknown to the outside world, they were also holding 2 other captives, a young woman named Rebecca Foster, who had been missing for over a week, and an elderly man identified as Luther Grimby, a traveling preacher who had disappeared the previous month. The revelation that multiple victims were being held simultaneously showed how confident the family had become in their methods and how dramatically they had escalated their activities. What had begun as opportunistic murders of isolated travelers had evolved into something approaching an industrial killing operation, with prisoners being held, sorted, and executed according to an elaborate schedule that treated human life as raw material for the family's twisted purposes. Winters realized that time had run out for careful investigation and legal procedures. If Mercy's information was accurate, innocent people were going to die within hours unless immediate action was taken. But he also knew that a direct confrontation with the Harden family would be extraordinarily dangerous. They were armed, prepared for resistance, and operating from a fortified position that they had spent years perfecting for exactly this type of situation. Constable Winters faced the most difficult decision of his law enforcement career. Knowing that every choice carried deadly consequences, he could attempt to arrest the Harden family single-handedly, risking not only his own life, but potentially alerting them to escape before their current victims could be rescued. Alternatively, he could ride to Lexington for reinforcements, almost certainly condemning Patterson, Foster, and Grimby to death, while giving the Hardens time to destroy evidence and flee to another territory where they could resume their killing spree. The choice became easier when Winters realized he wouldn't have to act alone. Henrik Johansson, the Swedish farmer whose suspicions had been growing for months, volunteered immediately when approached for assistance. The immigrant's military experience in the Swedish army and his intimate knowledge of the local terrain made him an invaluable ally for what would essentially be a combat operation. Isaac Brewster also volunteered his services, driven by guilt over his failure to expose the Harper family's crimes in Tennessee years earlier. The peddler's knowledge of the family's previous methods and his experience with frontier violence would be crucial in anticipating their likely responses to attack. Two other men from town, Benjamin Stokes, the former bounty hunter, and Daniel Crawford, a veteran of Indian fighting, completed the hastily assembled rescue party. The plan they developed was necessarily simple, but extremely dangerous. The group would approach the Harden farm after midnight on May 23rd, using darkness and surprise to overcome the family's defensive advantages. Their primary objective was rescuing the imprisoned victims, with capturing the killers being a secondary consideration. If the Hardens could not be taken alive, the rescuers were prepared to use whatever force necessary to prevent their escape. Mercy provided crucial intelligence about the farm's layout and the family's likely defensive positions. The underground complex had only two entrances, the main access through the enlarged root cellar and a concealed emergency exit that emerged in the woods nearly a quarter-mile from the main house. The family kept weapons cached at both locations, and Ezekiel had drilled his sons in defensive tactics designed to hold off attackers long enough for the family to escape through the cave system. The approach to the farm required crossing nearly a mile of open ground that would leave the rescuers completely exposed if detected. Johansson's tracking skills proved invaluable in identifying a route that used creek beds and tree lines to provide maximum concealment. The group moved with the silence of experienced hunters, each man understanding that discovery would likely mean death for both themselves and the prisoners they were trying to save. What they discovered when they reached the Harden property exceeded their worst expectations and confirmed that Mercy's testimony had actually understated the scope of her family's crimes. The farm showed clear evidence of recent excavation work far beyond what any normal agricultural operation would require. Piles of earth and stone were scattered throughout the property, while the smell of lime and decay hung in the air like a physical presence. The main house appeared normal from the outside, with warm light glowing in the windows and smoke rising from the chimneys. But as the rescuers drew closer, they could hear sounds that chilled their blood. Muffled voices coming from beneath the ground, occasional screams that were quickly silenced, and the rhythmic sound of metal striking stone that suggested ongoing construction work in the underground chambers. The rescue operation began at precisely 2 a.m. when the raiders believed the family would be least alert and most vulnerable to surprise attack. Winters and Johansson approached the main entrance to the underground complex while Stokes and Crawford positioned themselves to block the emergency exit. Brewster remained with the horses, ready to provide covering fire if the operation went wrong. The root cellar entrance proved to be far more elaborate than Mercy had described. What appeared from the surface to be a simple storage facility was actually a sophisticated fortification with multiple defensive positions and clear fields of fire. The Hardens had spent years preparing for exactly this type of assault, creating killing zones that would allow a small number of defenders to hold off a much larger attacking force. But the raiders' greatest advantage was complete surprise. The family had grown complacent after years of successful operation, never imagining that their carefully maintained cover could be penetrated by local law enforcement. When Winters and Johansson descended into the underground complex, they found Ezekiel and his sons completely unprepared for resistance, focused instead on the grisly business of preparing their current victims for execution. The rescue of the prisoners was both easier and more horrifying than the raiders had anticipated. They found William Patterson chained in a stone cell barely large enough for a man to stand upright, weak from days without adequate food, but alive and coherent. Rebecca Foster was in worse condition, showing signs of the treatments that Temperance had used to break her resistance. Luther Grimby was barely conscious, his health broken by weeks of captivity and psychological torture. But the prisoners were not the only occupants of the underground complex. As the raiders penetrated deeper into the cave system, they discovered evidence of the family's crimes that defied human comprehension. The limestone chambers contained a charnel house of human remains spanning nearly a decade of systematic murder. Bones, clothing fragments, and personal effects were scattered throughout multiple rooms, creating an archaeological record of atrocity that would take weeks to fully catalog. The physical evidence was overwhelming in both scope and detail. In addition to the human remains, the raiders found the detailed records that Mercy had described, written in her careful handwriting and organized with the precision of a merchant's ledger. The notebooks contained the names, descriptions, and final possessions of 67 victims spanning 8 years, far more than the investigation had uncovered and representing one of the most extensive killing sprees in American criminal history. But perhaps the most damning evidence was discovered in what Ezekiel had called his courtroom. The underground chamber contained not only the makeshift judge's bench and religious symbols that Mercy had described, but also a collection of personal trophies taken from victims. Scalps, jewelry, weapons, and other mementos were displayed like battle honors, creating a museum of murder that revealed the full extent of the family's sadistic pride in their crimes. The capture of the Harden family proved to be swift but violent, as Ezekiel and his sons attempted to fight their way out of the underground complex rather than face the justice they had denied their victims. The patriarch showed no surprise at being discovered, instead launching into a rambling sermon about divine judgment and the righteousness of his mission. Even as gunfire echoed through the stone chambers, Caleb and Josiah fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they faced certain death if captured. Using their intimate knowledge of the cave system to launch attacks from concealed positions, the battle raged through multiple chambers for nearly an hour, with the raiders forced to advance carefully through passages that the defenders had prepared as killing zones. The end came when Temperance, trapped in the main house above, attempted to destroy evidence by setting fire to the building and its contents. The flames spread rapidly through the dry timber structure, threatening to collapse the main entrance to the underground complex and trap everyone below. Ainsway. Faced with the choice between burning alive and surrendering, the surviving Hardens finally laid down their weapons. Only Mercy surrendered willingly, her confession having already condemned her family and sealed their fate. She was found in her room kneeling in prayer and apparently resigned to whatever judgment awaited her. Her cooperation with the investigation had been motivated not by moral awakening, but by terror that her father's paranoia would eventually mark her for execution, along with the family's other perceived enemies. The aftermath of the Harden family's capture sent shockwaves throughout Kentucky and the broader frontier region, forcing communities to confront the terrifying reality that one of their most respected families had been systematically murdering travelers for nearly a decade. The evidence recovered from the underground complex was so overwhelming and disturbing that local authorities struggled to process the full scope of the crimes. The investigation that followed the raid revealed details that exceeded even the raiders' worst expectations. The cave system beneath the Harden farm was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, stretching for nearly 2 miles through natural limestone caverns that the family had modified for their murderous purposes. Multiple chambers had been excavated and reinforced, creating an underground complex that could house dozens of prisoners simultaneously. The physical evidence recovered from these chambers painted a picture of systematic murder that spanned not just the 8 years the family had lived in Kentucky, but potentially decades of similar crimes in other territories. In addition to the 67 victims documented in Mercy's careful records, searchers found personal effects and human remains that suggested the true number of murders was significantly higher. Particularly disturbing was the discovery of children's clothing and toys among the recovered evidence, indicating that entire families had been murdered rather than just individual travelers. The Henley family, who had disappeared during the December blizzard, were found to have been held in the underground complex for over a week before being executed. Their children, ages 6 and 8, had been kept alive for several days after their parents' deaths before being killed and their bodies disposed of in the deepest parts of the cave system. The trial of the Harden family began in late June 1799 and lasted for nearly a month, drawing spectators from across Kentucky and the surrounding territories. The courthouse in Lexington was packed daily with crowds that included victims' relatives, curious onlookers, and legal experts who recognized the case as unprecedented in American criminal history. The evidence presented was so overwhelming and disturbing that the presiding judge, Honorable Samuel Whitmore, ordered portions of the testimony sealed from public view. Ezekiel Harden's behavior during the trial shocked even experienced court observers. Rather than showing remorse for his crimes or attempting to minimize his family's responsibility, he used his testimony as an opportunity to deliver extended sermons about divine justice and the righteousness of his mission. He claimed that every murder had been sanctioned by God as part of a holy war against sin and corruption on the frontier. According to Ezekiel's twisted theology, he and his family had been chosen as instruments of divine judgment, tasked with eliminating unworthy souls who posed a threat to the moral order of Christian civilization. The money and goods taken from victims weren't theft, but righteous compensation for their sacred work. The elaborate underground complex wasn't a prison, but a courthouse where God's justice was administered, according to biblical principles. His wife and sons maintained their innocence despite overwhelming evidence, insisting they had been coerced into participating by Ezekiel's religious fanaticism and threats of violence. Temperance claimed that her medical knowledge had been used against her will to keep prisoners alive, while Caleb and Josiah testified that their father had convinced them they were fighting a holy war against agents of Satan who threatened their community. These claims were contradicted by extensive evidence showing that all family members had participated willingly and enthusiastically in the murders. Mercy's detailed records included notations in different handwritings, indicating that each family member had contributed to documenting their crimes. Personal items found in their rooms included trophies taken from victims, suggesting that the killings provided psychological satisfaction rather than mere material gain. Only Mercy Harden expressed genuine remorse for her role in the murders, though her testimony revealed that her cooperation with authorities had been motivated primarily by fear rather than moral awakening. She provided crucial details about the family's methods and helped identify many of the victims whose remains had been found in the cave system. Her willingness to testify against her family members earned her a degree of mercy from prosecutors, though she would still face severe punishment for her participation in the crimes. The sentences handed down by Judge Whitmore were swift and decisive, reflecting both the severity of the crimes and the community's demand for justice. Ezekiel, Temperance, Caleb, and Josiah Harden were all condemned to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for August 15, 1799. The date was chosen deliberately. It marked exactly 1 year since Samuel Fletcher's disappearance had first exposed the family's crimes and begun the investigation that led to their capture. Mercy Harden received a sentence of life imprisonment, sparing her from execution in exchange for her cooperation with authorities and her youth at the time. Many of the crimes were committed. She would spend the remaining 43 years of her life in the Kentucky State Penitentiary, becoming one of the longest-serving prisoners in the institution's history. The executions drew the largest crowd in Kentucky's history to that point, with over 4,000 people traveling from throughout the region to witness the end of the frontier's most notorious family of killers. The event took on an almost carnival atmosphere, with vendors selling food and drink to spectators who had made long journeys to see justice served. Ezekiel maintained his religious fanaticism to the very end, using his final words to deliver a rambling sermon in which he cursed the community that had rejected his vision of divine justice. He predicted that God would punish Kentucky for executing his chosen servants, and that the frontier would be overrun by the very sinners his family had worked to eliminate. His wife and sons died in silence, their deaths bringing closure to one of the darkest chapters in early American criminal history. The Harden farm was burned to the ground immediately after the executions, with every building reduced to ash and rubble in a ceremony that took on ritualistic significance for the traumatized community. The underground chambers were sealed with explosives and tons of rock, creating a tomb that would ensure the family's victims could finally rest in peace. Local authorities declared the land cursed and forbade any future construction on the site. But the legacy of the Harden family's crimes extended far beyond their own deaths, establishing important precedents in frontier justice and fundamentally changing how communities viewed the balance between hospitality and security. The case led to new laws requiring background verification for land purchases and established protocols for investigating missing persons that would influence law enforcement practices for decades. More importantly, the Harden case served as a chilling warning about the dangers of blind trust in religious authority and the ease with which evil could hide behind a facade of respectability. Communities throughout the frontier began questioning their assumptions about neighbors and strangers alike, recognizing that surface appearances could mask the darkest intentions. The legal proceedings also established important precedents for the use of circumstantial evidence in capital cases and the protection of witnesses who cooperated with authorities. Mercy Harden's testimony demonstrated that family loyalty could be overcome by proper incentives and legal protections, paving the way for similar prosecutions in other complex criminal cases. The surviving records of the case were sealed by court order in 1801, with access restricted to law enforcement officials and legal scholars. This decision was made partly to protect the privacy of victims' families, but also to prevent the case from inspiring copycat crimes by other twisted individuals who might see the Hardens' methods as a blueprint for their own murderous ambitions. For nearly 2 centuries, the full truth about the Harden family remained hidden in those sealed documents, with only fragments of the story surviving in local folklore and family traditions. The few historians who were granted access to the files were required to sign confidentiality agreements that prevented them from publishing their findings or sharing details with other researchers. Even local memory gradually forgot the specific details of the murders, transforming the story into vague tales of bad folks who had once lived along Beaver Creek. The location of the farm itself became uncertain as property lines changed and new settlers arrived, who knew nothing of the area's dark history. By the mid-1800s, only a few elderly residents could accurately point out where the Harden homestead had stood. The rediscovery of the case files in 1987 finally allowed historians to piece together the complete story of Kentucky's first family of serial killers. But even today, many questions remain unanswered. The cave system where the family disposed of their victims has never been fully explored, and authorities believe additional remains may still be hidden in the deepest passages that were too dangerous for 18th century investigators to access. Modern forensic techniques could potentially reveal much more about the family's crimes, but the sealed caverns would be extremely difficult and expensive to excavate. Local authorities have shown little interest in reopening what they consider a historical matter, preferring to let the dead rest undisturbed rather than risk new revelations that might traumatize descendants of the victims. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the Harden case has forced historians to reconsider other unexplained disappearances along frontier roads throughout the early American period. How many other respectable families might have been hiding similar secrets? How many missing travelers were victims not of random violence, natural hazards, or Indian attacks, but of carefully planned murders by people they trusted? The statistical analysis of frontier disappearances reveals troubling patterns that suggest the Harden family may not have been unique. Clusters of vanishings near other prosperous charitable families have been identified in Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia during the same time period. While none of these cases have been definitively linked to systematic murder, the similarities are striking enough to warrant further investigation. The answers to these questions died with Ezekiel Harden on that August morning in 1799. But the questions themselves serve as a chilling reminder that evil often wears the most innocent face. The greatest horrors in human history have frequently been committed by those who believed they were doing God's work. And the frontier period of American expansion created countless opportunities for such twisted individuals to operate with impunity. The Harden case also highlights the vulnerability of isolated communities that valued reputation over evidence and trust over vigilance. The family's success depended not just on their own criminal skills, but on their neighbors' willingness to dismiss uncomfortable evidence in favor of maintaining social harmony. The price of that willingness was measured in human lives. This mystery shows us that the frontier justice of early America was often more complex and disturbing than traditional histories have acknowledged. The expansion westward created not just opportunities for honest settlers seeking new lives, but also perfect hunting grounds for predators who understood how to exploit the trust and desperation of vulnerable travelers. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Harden family's crimes, or might there be even darker secrets still buried beneath the Kentucky soil? Could similar families have operated in other frontier regions without ever being discovered? Leave your comment below and share your theories about this case. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.